Okay, well, let us reward the people who are prompt and the many thousands of people who will view this after we've done this program. But I am Steve Orleans, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be joined by Kai-Fu Lee, my old friend. And I'm even more thrilled to have read this extraordinary book, AI, 10 Visions for Our Future, 2041, which Kai-Fu and Chen Qiufan have written and recently translated into English. One of the great things about my job is I get to read books by friends and colleagues. And this one was really a pleasure. More than a pleasure. It was absolutely enthralling. At the National Committee, what we often try to do is find ways to educate people. And what I'm frequently telling my colleagues, Chinese officials, American officials, is you educate through story, that you tell a story that delivers a message, and then you explain the message, that it's really a terrific political technique on how to educate. And what Kai-Fu has done with this book is and with Mr. Chen, who wrote the fiction part of it, and Kai-Fu wrote the nonfiction part of it, is tell these absolutely compelling science fiction stories related to AI. And then Kai-Fu explains, is this realistic? Is this not realistic? How does it work? I loved AI Superpowers, his former book, his last book, which was on the New York Times bestsellers list. But this one is really compelling. If anyone on this has not read it yet, read it. It is truly a wonderful experience, one which for me, who doesn't know much about AI, it really educated me about AI and what we should think about looking into the future. So I've always been an admirer of Kai-Fu, now even more so. I won't go over, we won't go over his bio because we talked about all the awards and all the things that he has done. We wouldn't have time for the program, but he is the CEO of Sinovation Ventures. And as everybody knows, his story from AI Superpowers started out at Carnegie Mellon, was at Google, Microsoft, other companies, and then started Sinovation, which invests in startup companies. So Kai-Fu, I've given a big pitch for the book. This is the cover. It was so imaginative. How did you come up with the idea of kind of combining fiction with AI analysis?
Well, thank you, Steve, for having me on this webinar. The idea is that I believe it's incredibly important for everyone to understand what AI is and is capable of, and its potential dangers and how to fix them. And yet many people find AI intimidating because it seems like it's a rocket science, but it really isn't. So I try to explain it in plain language in AI Superpowers. I think I had some limited success, and people told me they thought they understood some of AI actually with me explaining it in a nonfiction, but then still people were intimidated. So I thought, well, the only way to get people to truly understand AI is through entertaining and engaging storytelling, which I personally cannot do. So I reached out to my friend, Chen Qiufan, also known as Stanley Chen, to ask if he would write the stories. And he kindly agreed. It is rather unusual that a science fiction writer who's used to let the imagination run wild was willing to constrain his imagination to what I paint as feasible and unfeasible, and only write about what's feasible in the next 20 years. But he's done an amazing job, and hopefully the book delivers the engaging aspect and draws people in who otherwise might find AI to be intimidating, and who might have been misinformed about AI, who can now get hopefully the right picture. And after each story, I give an explanation of the technology, what it can and cannot do, the problems it might introduce on society, and how we might deal with it. So that's how it came about.
And how did you arrive at the 10 stories and the different kind of aspects of AI? That must have been difficult because you could think about 5,000.
Yeah, it was a puzzle. We're putting together a puzzle. I wanted about 20 technologies covered, from natural language processing to quantum computing to drug discovery. I wanted about 20 technologies covered, and I wanted to see them covered from easy to hard, and I wanted to see them covered applied to different industries like entertainment, communications, healthcare, and work, etc. So that was my puzzle. And then Stanley introduced another puzzle. He wanted to have 10 stories take place in 10 different parts of the world, partly to make the stories more interesting and partly to show that this will impact all countries and all industries. So we mixed these 4 puzzles together, and then we brainstormed possible storylines, and then he went off and wrote the stories, and then I wrote the commentary. That's how the puzzle came together. We didn't quite cover every technology. There were a few we wish we could get in, but the puzzle just didn't fit.
Now, because we're the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and our audience are basically people who are looking at the U.S.-China relationship, what is the message the book conveys about U.S.-China relations?
This book isn't in particular about U.S.-China, but it paints a world in which we really need to work closely together under more, not less, globalism, with more, not less, trust between countries, because our fates is very linked. For example, autonomous weapons can only be regulated with cooperation from countries. And many of the governance ideas can become universal if people come to a common understanding. And also technology advances were driven by China and US, and the scientists ought to work together. Fortunately, they still do. So those are some things one could read through the stories. And also in some of the background, it is clearly still portraying that technologies coming from US and China are the 2 most significant technology superpowers that will continue in 20 years. So these are the subtle aspects one could find in the book, but it's really not prominent.
Which areas should the United States and China with respect to AI be cooperating? Which ones should cooperation be limited? And which ones can we really not cooperate on? I mean, I hear discussions in Washington that quantum computing is just, we should not really be cooperating in that because it can be, there's too much military applicability there. So how do you kind of divide those areas?
Right. I think AI as a general omni-use technology, deep learning extensions, including some of the more recent advances beyond deep learning, are pretty universal. The papers are published even with source code and data, and the Chinese, European, American scientists are already working together, and the technologies are already applied to industries. So I think that is the horse has left the barn, and it's becoming omni-use applied to industries. More cooperation, I think would be very suitable. There are obviously civilian and non-civilian applications, but the cooperation on civilian, which is a much larger part, I think can and should go on. Specifically, the use of AI in climate, in healthcare, ought to be less controversial, and potentially the use for profit making, for use in financial industries and other industries, I think could also span multiple countries. I think both countries will assert that on technologies that relate to national security or defense, that's an area where each country should develop its own, and probably Europe and Russia will also want to develop their own. And I think autonomous weapons, the development of that should I think will happen independently, but they should be regulated working together.
Right.
And I think quantum computing, I can see the logic of why having a quantum supremacy is important to many countries. And because I think quantum computing basically changes the paradigm of computing and makes possible things like breaking computer security, figuring out extremely fast communications, completely disrupting the type of every algorithm from AI and so on. So I think I can see countries wanting to be superior in quantum, and it's not a technology that I think people are inclined to work together with other companies. Companies are doing it, and I think each company and probably each country views it as an expensive endeavor that would give it an advantage in a disruptive future direction. So I think I would understand that one. And there are probably other, basically the question I think is, if it's really legitimately related to national defense and security, I think it's understandable that cooperation be limited. Everything else, I would hope for more cooperation.
Aren't we seeing both governments? If I agree with you, I'm 100% in agreement with you, we should find ways to cooperate, but aren't we seeing both governments actually move in the opposite direction? More restrictions on data, blocking of Chinese acquisitions of companies in the United States that have access or are a bank for healthcare data, for individuals' data, dating apps. Obviously DD, having certain data, and that actually the walls, rather than getting lower, are getting higher. What I've always argued for is defining national security narrowly and building those walls very high, but for the other things, don't have walls at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if we trace back on how this began, I think it was under President Trump that went after a number of these aspects. I'm not an expert on which of the policies are legitimate, which are questionable, but I think the Chinese government's preference would have been to continue globalism. China clearly has been a beneficiary and can now contribute, but I think seeing some of these companies that have been put on entities lists with export control, CFIUS, and the frequency and the degree of the application of these measures are making China feel that it needs to be self-sufficient in technologies. Otherwise, every company could follow the path of Huawei of being limited in its access to necessary infrastructural technologies. So yes, recently China has been extending its regulation too. It is kind of a symmetrical escalation, which is unfortunate, and I hope there will be some de-escalation. Otherwise, this will probably get worse, not better.
Yeah. The National Committee runs what are called Track 2 dialogues, and one of them is actually on the digital economy. And our hope is to be able to propose to both governments some rules of the road where we don't have this continuing expansion of restrictions, because ultimately these expansions of restrictions take the dream of AI and the good things that it can do, and it impedes the realization of that dream. I know the book's not about US-China relations, but the chapter, it was interesting, the chapter on a quantum genocide, which was riveting. I mean, I was late for an appointment because I was reading, it was the fiction part, not the analytical part. But it's about rogue actors. And is it fair to say the greatest threat of the misuse of AI is actually not from state actors, but from rogue non-state actors?
Uh, it's hard to say which is larger, but yeah, I would tend to agree because that's the difference with, let's say, nuclear weapons. While that's incredibly uh, dangerous, it is only a few countries that have it, and they can hopefully negotiate treaties and regulations and control themselves, and due to deterrence and some degree of trust, etc. Because states, I think, generally speaking, are much more trustworthy than non-state actors. So the big danger for autonomous weapons is that the cost of building one can be very low, like $1,000 equipping a drone with facial recognition and GPS and a little bit of dynamite. Then it becomes an assassination machine that flies at very fast speed, very small, very difficult to catch, and shoots someone point blank. And the other danger is that the terrorists do not have to sacrifice their lives, unlike the suicide bombers who do. So this lowers the barrier, the cost is lower, and also one could, a terrorist group can send a swarm of these. So I think that lowers the cost of terrorism and increases their lethality. So I do think it is much more dangerous. And in fact, I think any day now we're going to see some such activities, and countries are actually generally not taking this seriously enough, and it's going to take another autonomous weapon terrorist group 911 like event that I think will wake everyone up.
Yeah. How realistic, by the way, is the quantum genocide kind of fiction part, where this effectively a mad scientist, whose life has been ruined, kind of takes over?
I think it's higher than ever before, because with Unabomber, it's the character was built on Unabomber, but Unabomber is deranged and smart, but not a deep scientist. So nowadays, many more people have access to these AI technologies and the drone technologies and can program them. So I think that is more realistic than ever, more dangerous than ever. The part about that character becoming the first person to invent a quantum computer and uses the quantum computer to do bad things, that's much more speculative. Obviously, it's really the national laboratories and the IBMs and Googles that really are likely to make the big break in quantum. And those large companies and large national laboratories are not very likely to have such a deranged person at the top.
Yeah. I think it was Trump used to joke. He said, "We don't know if this is a state or a fat guy sitting in the basement who's hacking into stuff and trying to do all this." So the question, how do you need states to be behind this, or is it possible for kind of literally the mad scientists to, use AI to accomplish very nefarious objectives?
I think the mad scientists can do it, and depends on what bad things are being done. If it's really to build a small number of killer drones or slaughter bots, I think even an advanced hobbyist could build that. Don't you really need a deep scientist? So that's why I think the danger is becoming greater and greater, because the barrier to building AI is lower and lower. More and more people every year can program AI and do good things and also do bad things.
Yeah. It was interesting. As I was reading the book, there were two major incidents involving AI. One was the alleged assassination by Israel of the leading nuclear scientist, the person trying to create a nuclear weapon in Iran, who apparently a machine gun was placed, which was operated fully by AI. And the other was the sad action by the United States to have a drone strike on a car where the intelligence apparently was faulty. What are those? Are we very close to kind of what, you say 2041, but this is 2021? Sounds like we're getting
Yes,
pretty close.
I think we're pretty close. There's also, I think, an attempted assassination on the Venezuelan president, and also the alleged strike on the Saudi oil fields by Iran. And all of those have drones playing a role. There are two types of drones. In most of these cases, a very sturdy military-grade drones were used, and those are very high, expensive, and still out of reach by terrorists because they're not acquirable commercially. But I think the Venezuelan president assassination, I think that was using more of a standard hobbyist drone. I'm not certain, but those can be equally lethal today. So I do think in the next 3 years, we will see these killer drones do something terrible, and then we'll wake up and start reading all these papers that various people wrote. My book on autonomous weapon, the section was excerpted and published in the Atlantic. And there are other people who have written several thousand AI scientists, along with the late Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, have written a plea that governments should look at the regulation or perhaps banning of autonomous weapons. But it's all fallen on deaf ears, and I'm afraid it's going to take a terrible atrocity that will wake people up.
What is the widespread use of 5G going to affect this?
Certainly, communications is an important element for any misuse of AI technologies.
Or positive.
Without 5G,
right.
Yeah, of course, positive and negative. The drones wouldn't be able to operate if they couldn't use the GPS element, for example, and the 5G. But that's already, I think, a reality. It is the way it is. Yeah. So, and I think going on to 6G, it will even enable other types of things.
I saw when I was watching a demonstration of 5G. I was in Shanghai, and they showed a mechanical arm mining rare earths, I think in Guizhou or something where years ago miners would have died. Now it's just a machine, and they can and they obviously, it's 1,000 miles, 1,500 kilometers, and they could sit there, and the 5G was so perfect that they could mine and operate according. I mean, and that's obviously all AI and a combination of AI and 5G. It was one of the most, it really brought home to me the lives that could be saved by AI.
Yeah, absolutely. In dangerous situations, in mines or accidents or fires, robotic technologies can be life-saving. And the way robotic technologies are likely to be developed is first in extreme conditions where people are willing to pay a very high price, such as these, and then moving into the factories. And then within factories, there will be smart forklifts, smart autonomous vehicles, smart arms that can grasp any object, and then that will be refined by use at the high price paid by the manufacturing companies to basically replace routine work by people. And then the technology will become cheaper, then adopted in commercial applications like restaurants and malls, and then it will come to our homes and become great household helpers. So that's something we can look at a 20-year horizon and see pretty much all of the routine human labor will be doable by robots. And I think that will be one of the big advances, and it will free up a lot of our time. So the positive benefits are definitely much larger.
Yeah. Now, in the Holy Driver, you talk about, autonomous vehicles and the use of AI, and it's this. I mean, I don't want to ruin the ending, how lives could be saved this way. But you also then, in the analytical part, you talk about will the regulatory apparatus be willing to deal with the general savings of lives? So you will have, the data will show we save lives, but there will be an instance or two or 5 or 10 where someone dies as a result. How does that get resolved? And is that something where China is able to look at the broader data, whereas democracies can't?
It's possible. Yeah, the specific issue that, Steve, you were talking about is AI gets better with data. So if you allow an autonomous vehicle to launch, it will certainly make mistakes, but maybe we don't allow it to launch unless it drives roughly as well as people, maybe a little better. I think that is feasible. Then it will gather more data, and then in another month, a new software will be sent to all the vehicles, and then it will drive better, much better than people. And then in a year, 5 years, 10 years, it will become so much better at driving than people, because it's seen billions of miles, and no human has ever seen that. And it's honed to a perfect driving capability. Also, the autonomous vehicles can talk to each other and just miss each other by an inch, and humans cannot have that precision. And also, a autonomous vehicle that might be having trouble, like a blown tire, can broadcast to nearby cars to stay away from me, and humans can't respond in that kind of a split-second accident or issue. So it's very clear that in, let's say, given 10 years, from launch to 10 years, autonomous vehicles ought to save 90% of the lives lost on the road today. This is a scientifically estimated projection by McKinsey. So the question is, what if we launch it and it's yet many people die because of it? Not more people died than human drivers. Are we willing to say we'll launch the product when it's as good as human, and the autonomous vehicle will make mistakes? There will be people who get hit and who die, not worse than people, but different people. And then over time, it gets better. Is that a price we're willing to pay? So I think different people and different governments will feel differently, and we'll see how that plays out. But I would bet many countries, perhaps including China, would feel at a 10-year horizon, that's a good thing. And at no given moment in time, is it worse than people? Then it's something we could look into. One could also extrapolate on robotic surgeries, on doctors who diagnose patients. Similar issues with human lives will be involved. So I think we should go in with our eyes open and have the intellectual debate now.
The AI is going to make fewer mistakes. An AI radiologist is going to make fewer mistakes than the best radiologist in the world, because the best radiologist, maybe he's seen 100,000, but the AI has seen 100 million.
Right.
So they will simply make fewer mistakes. So no one should suffer from that transition to AI radiology.
I don't know. I don't know, because the problem is when AI makes the mistakes, many of those mistakes look silly to people and actually look ridiculous. And it could be viewed as irresponsible. How could you launch a product like that is so immature? For example, when Tesla, the first Tesla accident that killed the driver using autopilot, the Tesla saw a giant white truck and the reflections as sky, and it drove right into the truck. I would say probably no human driver would ever make that mistake. And people are shocked and angry that how could Tesla launch such a ridiculous product? But if you look at the track record of autopilot, it's actually driven safer than people in terms of total fatalities. But when it makes a mistake, it's a ridiculous, unforgivable mistake.
Wow.
That, I think, is the dilemma we'll be facing.
Wow, that is fascinating. That is fascinating. You've talked about kind of and the book talks about this in various places, that, and especially in the chapter on plenitude. So AI is able to kind of reduce the amount of time we need to do things. Things are able to be produced less expensively, so they're more broadly distributed. Money becomes less important. Two questions on that. One is, China is confronting a demographic challenge, which we talk about a lot at the National Committee. Its workforce has already peaked. It's reducing its population, is on the verge of peaking. Is AI going to solve that problem for China?
The problem of population not growing, or the population of retraining?
A population not growing. Because generally population not growing would lead to reductions in GDP. That population growth is generally one of the ways that GDP will grow. Right.
I'm probably somewhat contrarian on this view, so I'll answer it, but I would say many people would disagree with me. I feel with AI and robotics taking over so much routine work, countries that grow too much in population may not see the historical correlation with GDP growth anymore. And in that case, countries like India may be facing more of a challenge than countries like China in terms of the population growth. There are obviously a lot of smart people who disagree on that, so we'll have to see how it plays out. In my opinion, if we believe AI over the next 20 years will displace 50% of human work, which is routine, and that means there will be a large job rotation, huge issue with redistributing income to the people who lost their jobs, and a big problem in terms of retraining people for skills that are not easily replaced by AI, and the individual is capable of being trained and learning that new skill. I think that is a set of challenges I feel would be of highest priority. We're seeing the very beginnings of that, not enough sign to worry any governments or politicians yet, but I think it may get worse, especially as COVID we get out of COVID, yet companies may not be hiring people back and maybe using automation. We might see a jump, but that's something I believe will happen one day, and but we have to see the data to validate that.
Certainly in the healthcare sector, we're using much more robotics, much more telemedicine. That we've seen a shift, which I would have thought probably would have taken 20 years, has occurred in 18 months. And there's no question it will also reduce employment. And in your chapter on plenitude, you talk about the need to retrain people. Mm-hmm. Right. And government taking over that responsibility. You have this one also in plenitude. You talk about moolah, which is the new money which you collect by doing good deeds. So two questions. One, does this in your mind stem from China's social credit system that is beginning to take hold in China? That people, if they don't visit their parents, they lose credit. If they jaywalk, they lose credit. But if they do good things for society, they gain credit. So is that related? And then the second kind of subsidiary question is China's central bank digital currency some step in that direction, making all current, getting rid of paper money?
Actually, those were not my inspirations, the social credit system and the central bank system. But the reason I decided to put that in the story, it's a very speculative direction. Of course, I can't prove that is the direction we must go. It's more motivated by my belief that work for economic gains will become more diminished. That is, if we only had human jobs and professions for work that will have an economic benefit to the society, we won't have enough jobs for everyone because AI will have taken over so much of it. And yet, if we think about what humans can do that AI cannot do, obviously there's creativity, there's your job, my job, the CEO's job, M&A expert's job, scientist's job. Yes, there are those, but it's a small percentage. What is the large number of existing lower middle class people going to do when AI takes over all the routine job? So my thoughts that I began to express in AI superpowers that went into AI 2041 is that it is really service jobs that will not be replaceable by AI because there's human connection required, because as everything becomes cheaper, people won't want to pay a premium for services, for a wonderful masseuse, for a great concierge, for tour guide, and for healthcare services. And some of the healthcare services are not necessarily, economic requirements. That is, an elderly care, elderly companion, someone to take an elderly person to see a doctor, or foster home volunteer, hotline volunteer, someone who decides to homeschool their children. These are all activities worth compensating people for, worth calling jobs, if you will, yet they don't really contribute much economically to society, but it gives people something meaningful to do. These jobs create positive social energy. It gives people a sense of satisfaction, having helped, seeing a smile from the elderly person they spend time with. So there should be encouragement of this type of human-to-human connection service type of services. So it was with this thought in mind that I thought, instead of just encouraging people with a pay, they should be encouraged with some kind of a digital system that measures their contribution socially. So it was inspired by this, not the other factors.
It's interesting. I mean, you say tour guides. I would say tour guides have, to some degree, already been replaced by very simplified AI. So once upon a time, you need somebody to walk you around a museum. Now you simply put on earphones, and when you get to a particular place, the museum talks to you with what the tour guide formally said.
Yeah.
A very simple kind of AI.
Yes, but I think there's also room for a storyteller. If tour guides should compete against that by being a brilliant storyteller, incorporating personal experience, fun anecdotes, things that are very personal and connect human to human. There are still many of those tour guides. I hope that could emerge to be sufficiently competitive.
The storytelling
it's the
is what
same. Yeah. Also, like a chef and a waiter. We're investors in China, and there are a lot of companies coming up with robotic chefs and robotic waiters and waitresses, and they're very effective, very cost effective. I think they will populate to middle or lower end restaurants, maybe like equivalent of Denny's in the US, higher than McDonald's, but not a high end restaurant. But then that I think accentuates the value when you go to a top restaurant, a Michelin restaurant, or maybe something less expensive but still a fancy restaurant. People will treasure even more the human service that's provided. So I think a lot of things will become multi-tiered. At the top will be the human service providers, curators, and people who deliver an amazing experience. And on the bottom will be robots taking over the jobs.
I was in, it was a 连锁店, it was a, whatever 连锁店 is, it was a chain restaurant, but it was a chain 火锅 restaurant, hot pot. And,
yeah.
And a robot came out,
Mhm.
This is pre-pandemic, and on its here, you pressed what you wanted, and you
Yep.
made your order, and then I expected the robot to bring the food out, but then a person brought the food out, so their AI was rather imperfect. I mean, their robotics
Right.
was imperfect. You know, somebody, this gets to a question someone has asked, which is Liu Qiufan from Beijing Language and Culture University. Uh, she thinks AI has its limits. For example, this is an interesting question. No matter how advanced AI technologies are, professional translators and interpreters are still needed. Are we exaggerating the potential of AI by thinking that those jobs will get eliminated?
The highest well, it goes back to the concierge and the chef and the waiter. The same will happen with translators. The very high end, super, if you translate for the president of a country or a president of a large Fortune 500 company, that is unlikely to be taken over by AI in the next 20 years because mistakes are extremely costly and there's a lot of subtlety. But business translation is rapidly being taken over by semi-autonomous methods. I'll describe to you what is happening today. So we're investors in two companies, one called the Chen, the other is called Langboat. And the two of them are working together. One is on a domain-specific, high-quality text translation. The other is building a tool for translators. And the tool still has people using the tools. The people has the final say on what the translation looks like. But the AI does the first pass. And we're seeing AI improving very rapidly by 12% just in the last year. So that means 12% more of the translations don't have to be touched by the human anymore. And we're seeing the overall productivity of the translator pool go up significantly, costs come down significantly because AI is doing more and more and more. Of course, the translators feel very empowered because AI is doing all the routine basic translation and the translator gets to tweak a little here and a little there. But what they don't see is the amount of reliance on their human capacity is coming down over time. So we're actually in a very strange time in history right now because I know you as the person who asked the question is probably looking at the boom in the human translator space. I do believe in the past year, there are more people who get paid by more translator jobs as a result of more people using machine translation and not happy with the result and hiring a human to fix it. But this boom is a transient thing. And as technology gets better with more data, the human reliance and requirement for human will come down. It's very much similar to bank tellers and ATMs. When ATMs first came out, it drew people to the bank, they had to hire more tellers. But eventually, ATM became more and more powerful, and tellers had to be moved to other jobs. So I would be quite confident that in a 10 to 20-year horizon, the number of professional translators will come down significantly, even dramatically. And the ones who remain are going to be the ones who are so good at it. They're like instantaneous voice translator or extremely high quality, no mistake tolerated kind of jobs.
Why is your former employer's translation function so mediocre? I'm shocked when I use it. I'm just shocked at because they should have data, more data than they possibly can analyze to make their translations more accurate. What's going on?
I don't think they put the state of the art. The state of the art requires a lot more compute power and the number of users who use it. And also they make no money from the product. So they put a older version. But even then, if you look at the quality of the product 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's been big advances. And also just in the last 2 years, there's a huge advancement, almost a breakthrough, called self-supervised learning. And if you probably know it by GPT-3 or Transformer or BERT, these are the technologies coming out of Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI that allows essentially trillions of data to be used for training a super smart natural language engine on top of which you can build machine translation and also targeted for specific industries like electronics or finance. And we are seeing big jump in performance. So I would be very comfortable predicting that in 5 years, we will have speech recognition dramatically better than they work today, even though they're pretty good already. We'll have machine translation, both text to text, but also a simultaneous voice to voice translation, so that you can go to a foreign country with earsets and have a decent conversation with someone with some mistakes, but decent, fluid conversation. It will jump in the next 5 years.
That will be amazing. I mean, certainly the voice recognition is already, 99.99%. When I give speeches in China,
Yeah.
I see on the sides, they have, the transcription going on if people don't understand my Chinese or my English. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's very distracting for the speaker.
Yes.
I mean, our jobs, partly because I come from Wall Street and started out doing credit analysis, is that kind of job just going to disappear? It's all going to be done by AI because AI is going to be better at judging the borrower with all the data that they have and all the data that they're able to sweep in through Ali and Tencent, and in the future for the digital currency, that those jobs are going to basically disappear?
Yes, I think all routine jobs are going to be gone. And there are some jobs that you would not think are routine. They're going to be gone too. For example, a radiologist's job, one would not think that's routine. A translator's job, one would not think that's routine, but it's all about data, huge amounts of data fed through to a mathematical quantitative algorithm. And the improvements are just very dramatic. And the way that jobs will be displaced will be, first, AI will come out as an assistant, radiologist assistant, translator's assistant, doctor's assistant for diagnosis. Then they will become quite good doing more decisions autonomously. Then one day will come when the professional will feel, wow, the AI is better than me. I don't dare override its decision anymore. And then it's going to flip and take over more jobs. I think people really have to be prepared for that. We are seeing the writing on the wall. As you were describing speech recognition, I worked on speech recognition in the 80s, and it barely worked back then. If you draw a curve of improvement, it goes like this, it actually goes like this in the more last 10 years, big jump due to deep learning and its descendants. So we really should become prepared for domains in which AI will emerge as an assistant and actually evolve into the main worker.
The chapter on that you call Golden Elephant kind of highlights potential inequalities in the use of AI. It's so smart. It's so interesting because it talks about insurance and how if you do one thing, you're given you've consented to kind of be followed and have everything you do be monitored, your insurance premium would jump up or drop down, which was I think just wonderfully interesting. I was going to ask my friends who run insurance companies if they're moving in that direction. But my question is, how do we deal with the systemic inequality, the potential systemic inequality in AI?
Yeah, today I think the inequality in AI is quite a serious matter, and people have to work on it. Fortunately, I think we can make a big improvement in the short term. We've probably read about, a large American company trained its HR AI using a lot more men than women, and it ended up being very biased against letting women pass the screen. And that kind of error in the imbalance of data that you expose to an AI system so much of one gender or race or whatever, and so little of others, will cause AI systems to be biased. And those can be caught by automatic tools that will alert the AI programmer of saying, you should not launch this because it will have this kind of an impact. So I think we can catch 80, 90% of the most obvious of the problems, because they're pretty obvious mistakes we should also train AI engineers to be conscientious that they're not just trying to build a tool, make money, but rather they're going to impact people's lives. So I think we can keep that under control. But there are a lot of subtleties that are very hard. The Golden Elephant was particularly written that way. There you have a well-intended, benevolent insurance company meaning to help people reduce their insurance premium, which ought to be correlated with them not getting sick as often. Seems like everybody wins, but yet still terrible things happen. So it is pointing out there are extreme cases and a lot more research needs to be done. We can capture the obvious cases and make it work much better, but the extreme cases require a lot more work. I would close on this question by saying, if we do a really good job on the big mistakes, I think we will reach a point that AI will be already less biased than people. We don't recognize how biased we are. Think about a loan officer at the bank. If you ask them, well, why did you turn down that person's loan? They'll usually give you a legitimate reason, insufficient income, too new at the job or something. But buried in that person's subconsciousness is a lot of bias and prejudice. Things like the person doesn't look trustworthy, or I don't trust, men or women or whatever. That kind of thing does come through, and we can do such a good job by honing the right data set, eliminating biases in the data as much as we can so that AI can and will do better than people. Another example with people is there's a study in Israel that showed that judges gave harsher sentences just before lunch, just because they were hungry. So it's not even caused by prejudice. They're just, I'm hungry, I'm going to be mean. So I think AI can and will do better. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it. We should work very hard on it to make AI as fair, unbiased as possible. But we should not look at it and say, well, it's so much worse than people, because we're all people. We can think about, are we really unbiased? I think we actually are quite poor, and AI should be a blessing if we do a good job.
Of course, the data will tell us whether there's a correlation between potential bias and outcomes. And then hopefully the person who's then creating, the programs can kind of get the bias out of the AI.
We can get a lot of it out. You can actually go further. If, let's say, racial bias is your biggest concern, then just remove race out of the data. Then it won't be pivoting on that column of saying, okay, treat the Chinese worse and treat the Filipino better or something like that. But I would also caution that even if you take that one out, there are probably other ways to infer race by the surname and place they live. They live in Chinatown, they're probably Chinese. So you probably have to remove a fair amount of data to remove most of the inferable racial elements. But if that's really important to the AI you want to build, then remove all of that.
Yep. I want to make sure I get to some audience questions before we close. Morgan Pierce from CSIS asks, experts are predicting that AI will displace many blue-collar workers, as you said. What's the Chinese government doing to provide a safety net for those who are going to be impacted?
Yeah, we are not seeing much action by any government right now on this AI displacement issue, because I think most of the displacements are absorbed in the employment process. That is, people lose their jobs, then they go on and find something else. So we haven't reached a point where large numbers of displacements are causing the government to have to step in. On the U.S. side, I think COVID has made unemployment numbers not so dependable. So despite efforts, like Andrew Yang, he speaks up about the need for universal basic income due to AI displacement, but 1% of U.S. listens to him. So he's getting some voice, but the government hasn't really seen it necessary to come out with any policies. I would say China is not looking at the terrible unemployment number. And I would say, generally speaking, when governments are not seeing bad unemployment numbers, they're not likely to proactively deal with this.
Mhm. Hugh Mo from his law firm asked, since China is the leading country in development and implementation of AI, what's the implication for the US and Europe in light of the open competition and potential conflict with China in the years ahead?
Well, commercial AI is not really a conflict between countries. Tencent, Alibaba, Google, Amazon can all be successful. They all have different products, different geographies. So I think on the commercial aspect, I would anticipate American companies to be really successful, probably more so in enterprise software space like C3 AI and Palantir and the like. Chinese companies will probably see more robots and automation because of the manufacturing prowess. And I think both countries will do well. Europe, I think, will not be able to emerge as a giant in AI, partly because I think the EU wants to limit AI because of their concerns about personal data and their concerns about internet companies having too much power. And also EU is not really one language, one culture entity. So an AI company will have a harder time penetrate all of EU, whereas the Chinese or American companies would not have that problem. It's a cohesive single language, single culture, large market. So US, China will continue to be AI superpowers, as I predicted in my last book.
And that's why Europe developed this GDPR, which is replete with problems and makes kind of development of AI and collection of data, which would enhance AI, extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think GDPR is very well intentioned. It tries to protect things that we should try to protect, but it does so in ways that I think will impede the growth of AI. And to some extent, it will influence other countries, including US and China, to use GDPR as a reference and develop their own laws. But I think Europe will enforce it with the strictest requirement for compliance, and thereby making it more difficult to start an AI company in Europe compared to US or China.
Yeah, there's no question that Europe, the amount of venture capital in Europe, the amount of the number of startups in Europe is a tiny portion of the United States or China.
Right.
And I guess that's how it's going to be. The Europeans are willing to live with that result. It's interesting.
Yes, I spoke once to a European regulator and I said, all these policies will cause AI to slow down in Europe. And his answer was, Dr. Lee, that's not a side effect. That is what we intend. So that is a very different mentality than the American or the Chinese view. Yeah.
And is that, now I'll let you get to your paying job in a couple of minutes. Is that, are the views, because you've spent your life in China and the United States, are the views of the individuals just different with respect to data and privacy, that a Chinese is willing to give up their data in exchange for potentially more personal safety or more advancements in science? Americans are less willing and Europeans the least willing. Is that a fair characterization?
It is a reasonable high-level characterization, but the answer is much more nuanced. I think it's universal value that everybody wants to keep their personal data as private as possible. But when it comes to two priorities needing to be prioritized, I think Chinese and Europeans and Americans may prioritize them differently. An example is in COVID, right? Because of COVID, everyone in China has an extremely accurate contact tracing app that knows exactly where I've been and whether I've been in contact with anyone who may have contracted coronavirus. And as a result, and also the use of cameras, facial recognition, along with temperature. And when I go into a building, at least the building I work in, it knows who I am and what my temperature is. So if I have a fever, I will be invited, I will be asked to go to a hospital, no matter where I go. So that's the Chinese way. I think most Americans and certainly Europeans will find that unpleasant and maybe unacceptable. But today, if you do a survey to China of saying Chinese people, given this is how China controls coronavirus, these are the things you give up, these are the things you gain: safety, lower deaths, etc. Would you rather go for a Chinese approach or a European American approach? I would say almost 100% of Chinese people would say, I think it's a good trade-off that our government and our companies do what they do. And conversely, I also think most Americans, Europeans would prefer to keep the systems they have rather than adopt the Chinese system. So, while everyone wants personal private data, the answer is nuanced, and this is a case in point.
Wow, fascinating. Kai-Fu, thank you so much to our listeners and viewers. This book will give you hours of pleasure and lots of education. So thank you so much for being a great friend of the National Committee, and thank you for writing another great book.